I once knew a man who was not afraid of anything. He was the ultimate skeptic, and the mere mention of the word supernatural made him laugh. His name was Henkki, mostly because of his Finnish ancestry on his father's side, and although his parents had died when he was a child, it was obvious that he believed he was much like his father in character and had adopted many of his habits. I had met Henkki 4 years earlier when I was traveling with friends in Europe during a university vacation. He and some of his friends were on a similar trip and happened to be staying in the same youth hostel as me and my companions in Rome. Henkki and I immediately hit it off, as he was a keen musician and I was still full of hopes, or should I say illusions, that I would become famous for my guitar playing. This friendship continued and we maintained it via email, exchanging musical discoveries, talking about politics and generally getting to know each other more. Over the years, I grew to enjoy our friendly discussions more and more, and in some cases we even visited each other. Henkki moved around a lot, and this gave me a good excuse to visit several countries in continental Europe. Last year I visited Henkki in Amsterdam. This Dutch city seemed like a good fit for him because he had always liked to live in the busiest places, and Amsterdam, with its countless winding canals, bridges, and walkways that millions of tourists pass through each year, seemed to Henkki the epitome of life and vibrancy. At the time, he had recently been hired to do important renovation work on the Rijksmuseum, one of Amsterdam's most impressive buildings, and this seemed to tie him to one residence for a longer period of time than usual. When I met him in a small, dark corner of a local pub, away from the influx of tourists, I was shocked by his appearance. This was a friend I knew as a confident and strong man, but now I was faced with some frail kid with huge bruises under his eyes. He told me the circumstances which had led to his deplorable condition. Henkki had been a civil engineer for some time and was eager to take on the repair and maintenance of the Rijksmuseum, a building with such a long and interesting history. The museum houses Amsterdam's finest collection of historical relics, and access to some of its hidden areas, inaccessible to the general public, piqued Henkki's interest. He was hired specifically to lead a team of renovators tasked with assessing and repairing the building's foundations. This oldest part of the structure was several centuries old and had a most bizarre and, it must be said, rather gruesome history. The Rijksmuseum itself was built in 1885, but what it was built on had a much older and more interesting history. In the bowels of the building, beneath the marble floors and dark red brickwork, was a labyrinth of abandoned tunnels that had once served as part of the old city sewer system. They had long since fallen into disrepair and disuse, but they were nevertheless an important part of the building's foundation and had to be repaired, otherwise the entire structure was in danger of subsiding. The first and upper levels of the museum were beautiful and displayed many wonderful historical relics from around the world. The atmosphere in the building was so welcoming and warm that it was hard to imagine the darkness below. After exchanging a few words with the manager, Henkki made his way to an old, rarely used room at the back of the museum that housed a rather outdated, creaky and cage-like elevator that was used to access the lower levels and the sewers below. Donning a yellow jumpsuit covered in dirt, wearing a hard hat and carrying a headlamp, Henkki entered the elevator to make his first descent. As he descended into the abandoned sewer, Henkki thought about how mentally unstable people could go insane wandering in the darkness of the sewers. Perhaps that explained why the previous man in charge of repairs had left so abruptly, citing nervous exhaustion and refusing to ever set foot in those gloomy cold stone corridors again. The elevator's winch and motor hissed, lowering Henkki down 4 levels into the basement. With each floor passed, the lights dimmed a little, and each subterranean level seemed more sparse and stony than the previous one. A rusty plate attached to the elevator testified to its age. It occurred to Henkki that the year it was built, 1932, must have been one of the last years the place was renovated before the persecution of the Jewish people and the outbreak of war in Europe. Henkki knew much of the history of the region, as he himself was partly Jewish and his great-grandfather had died in the Holocaust. Many fled to Amsterdam to seek refuge from the Nazi regime in the early 1930s, but the long arm of Hitler's terrible, final solution eventually reached the borders of Holland, taking many thousands to those barbaric concentration camps. The elevator came to a shuddering halt, and pushing aside the corroded sliding door, Heinke stepped out. The tunnels, representing Amsterdam's abandoned sewer system, were curious in their design and held a history that went back much further than the history of the museum itself. After speaking to his employers, Heinke asked them to pay attention to how the appraisers and repairmen understood the tunnel's construction, as the place could be disorienting, and since the lighting system needed to illuminate the repairs had not yet been fully installed, it would be very easy to get lost. But most importantly, Heinke was informed that the radios normally used for communication between team members had begun to malfunction, and that they were very unreliable due to interference likely created by nearby metal deposits in the ground. This meant that communication between team members had to be done orally or by flashlight to transmit simple messages in Morse code. This was especially useful in long tunnels. In any case, it occurred to Heinke that the catacombs underground were indeed an isolated, lonely place. Caution must be exercised. Heinke was met by Jones, his second in command. Jones was a tough guy and quite humorous by nature. He briefed Heinke on the current progress of his new team, reporting that the initial mapping and assessment of the tunnels had gone well. There were a total of 16 four-man crews, each with a specific section of sewer to repair. Heinke would lead 2 crews that worked in one of the more isolated tunnels. After a 15-minute walk, Heinke arrived at the site that would be his workplace for the next few months. The sounds of intermittent drilling could be heard in the distance, and workers continued to install the still dormant lighting system. Since Heinke's men would be working farther ahead than the other crews, it seemed logical, though undesirable, that the lighting system be installed last. Each passage was oddly shaped, and no 2 tunnels were exactly alike. This entire section of sewer was so ancient that it had been built long before careful planning of such structures was commonplace. One tunnel curved in a strange semicircle for several hundred meters, and the others crossed it at right angles, going off into the darkness in a straight line. Heinke even found a passageway that seemed to go down and up and then curve in the shape of an unnatural English letter S. Some tunnels seemed to stretch on forever, others abruptly cut off, as if the builders had not finished their work in time and had left in a hurry. Jones tried to keep conversation light, and Heinke, who had had experience walking through the tunnels for the past 2 months, was glad to have a guide to show him the way. Waiting in the large alcove were 4 of Heinke's team. They would be working this section of the tunnels during the day and another shift would work through the night. Jones introduced each of them. They seemed pleasant enough people, but Heinke was surprised to find that the men were mostly silent. In his experience, humor was usually present in abundance, and repair crews used it to break through the monotony of working in such cramped and oppressive conditions. But here they spoke not a word, sitting silently in this imposing alcove, withdrawn from any thoughts of camaraderie or companionship. The only indication that they were not a collection of subterranean statues was the occasional movement of their headlamps altering the shadows around them. They seemed completely disconnected not only from each other, but from the environment in which they worked. Heinke dismissed this feeling of unease and busied himself with keeping the conversation going. If these people were annoyed or uncomfortable with each other, Heinke would quickly resolve it, for people in a good mood do work much more productively. The first order of business was to inspect this section of tunnels and decide where repairs were most urgent. Preliminary estimates had already been made, but Heinke liked to evaluate any repair project from scratch. Heinke walked through the catacombs with his team and immediately noticed that they were still on edge, that they looked scared in an almost childlike way. They answered any questions with one-word answers. As they explored the many tunnels, lighting their way with small flashlights attached to their protective helmets and making notes on failed walls, water damage and estimates of possible repair time, Heinke persistently asked the men about their obvious sense of dread, why such an experienced team, who had undoubtedly already worked in many tunnels, were so afraid of this sewer. They dodged the questions, glancing nervously at each other and changing the topic of conversation with monotonous lethargy whenever it came to their impressions of the old sewer or the unceremonious resignation of their previous boss. It began to dawn on Hankey that the men's verbal and physical awkwardness was not the result of tension between the workers, but rather a deep-seated and anxious fear of something he did not yet know. What was clear was that his crew seemed to be counting down the minutes until the end of their shift, when they would finally be able to escape the darkness to the safety of the world above. As the beam of his headlamp played on the damp and crumbling brickwork of the Hankey once again recognized that someone might indeed find this environment tense, but not him. Whatever had caused such trepidation and anxiety among the men working there was surely a simple case of idle superstition and the understandable psychological strain of working in a dark, cramped and forgotten corner of the world. Even Jones, who had been cheerful and talkative throughout most of the catacombs, now adopted the same sullen expression and serious attitude as the others. The passageways twisted and looped along the ground, long steady paths interrupted occasionally by sharp blind corners that made it hard for Hankey to tell exactly where they were. There were so many winding corridors that Hankey felt slightly disoriented and decided to even turn to the team to joke that if they didn't like him as a commander, they could just leave him here and he would never find his way back. But his men were no longer by his side. He stood at the mouth of the tunnel, and while he continued to speak, trying to fill the heavy silence, his men stopped at the last intersection. They stood motionless 20 feet behind him and looked at Hankey. It was a look of suppressed terror. When he asked why the men were not following him, they whispered that their repair work was ending at the spot where they now stood. Pulling out the map and examining it carefully by the light of his headlamp, Hankey decided that he must have wandered into the farthest part of the sewer system, the back of the catacombs, and although the tunnels went even deeper, the map showed the sewer system breaking off at that very spot. But on the wall near the entrance to the soy tunnel, Hankey could clearly see that someone had placed a plaque there, marking it with a repair. It read, Tunnel 72F, Water Damage and Deteriorating Brickwork. After double-checking Hankey's map, it became clear that Tunnel 72F was indeed under the foundation of the Rijksmuseum and needed to be assessed and repaired, but when he told his men about it, they simply informed him that they would finish the repairs where they were. Anger began to take over. Added to it was the frustration of the team he was supposed to be leading acting so stupidly, but even raising his voice and telling them to head for the tunnel didn't seem to budge them. Just when things got heated and Hankey started demanding that people do what he said, Jones intervened. "We've been working here for 2 months now, Hankey. You have a good, hard-working, talented team. They will do whatever you ask them to do and when you ask them to do it, but you will have to accept that for them and for me. Our work ends at this intersection and that neither of us will go anywhere near the 72F tunnel. Whether you want to believe it or not, there's something there." Taking a deep breath and calming himself down, Hankey explained to his men that he understood the stress of working long hours under these conditions, but repairs had to be made to this tunnel. He would talk to them about it later, but in the meantime he would do the inspection himself. As Hankey crossed the threshold and entered the forbidden tunnel, Jones and the others began to protest violently, shouting for Hankey to leave the passage immediately, but he thought this was foolishness. He could not be moved by unsubstantiated superstitious nonsense. There was nothing to fear in this tunnel, and Hankey was proving once again to the others that they need not be so afraid. He felt himself a strong man and had made his way where others, more timid by nature, were afraid to tread. For Hankey it was a source of pride. He felt he should always be brave, although at first glance the construction of the tunnel seemed quite ordinary. As Hankey moved deeper into the darkness it became clear that it was unlike any sewer he had seen before. The ground was uneven, the floor went down and up as in other tunnels, but what was unusual was that cracks could be felt underfoot. The ground was covered with thick, almost oily water that reached his knees in places. He waded very slowly through the stagnant water, not because he was afraid, but just to make sure there were no holes to fall into. One thing was obvious: no matter how long the water had been here, it was enough to make it stale and give off a foul, putrid odor. The walls were far more outdated than most of the brickwork he'd seen in sewers elsewhere. Whatever material had been used in these walls was hundreds of years old, and it was clearly deteriorating, long through cracks mottled the surface of the increasingly unstable walls and ceiling. The light of Hankey's headlamp was enough to illuminate most of the tunnel, but as he moved further into what he thought was a dead end, he realized that the passage was narrowing and the tunnel itself was not ending and was turning a corner. Hankey estimated that it was about 80 feet deep, and although curiosity about what might be around that corner urged him to move on, he felt that he had already made his point to his men and would now ask them to leave their fears behind and enter the tunnel with him. He unholstered the black handheld radio that had been issued to all the workers and began to ask Jones and the others to meet him at the corner of the tunnel. No one responded, and only a quiet buzzing sound came from the radio speaker. Of course, Hankey remembered that he had been warned about the unreliability of walkie-talkies, but just as he was about to turn and call out to his men, something caught his attention. There was nothing in this old tunnel but stagnant water and himself. But Hankey's self-confidence was inexorably pressed by a sneaking reality. Something was standing at the end of the tunnel. Hankey could only catch a glimpse of it from around the bend, but it was unmistakable. A tattered piece of cloth was sticking out from around the corner, and though Hankey's mind was unwilling to accept it, the cloth was clearly part of a sleeve with a hand in it. Skepticism and stubbornness could be an effective calming agent in even the most horrible and unbelievable situations. Hankey's faith in himself grew within him, filling his chest with pride, and Hankey took a firm, confident step towards whatever was around the corner. The splash of black water echoed through the tunnel as he reached that blind turn. Fear was replaced by sadness, for there stood a trembling and disheveled girl who looked no more than 13 years old. Her face and hands were blackened with dirt, hiding her pale and emaciated body. She was wearing only a tattered shirt that hung loosely on her. Looking at her between strands of dark matted hair, Hankey marveled at how beautiful the girl was and how scared she must have been. At first he thought she had somehow gotten into the sewers and gotten lost, but no matter how calmly he asked her, she didn't answer, looking scared and nervous. Hankey tried to radio the team again, but he heard the same meaningless static in response. Nevertheless, he had to get her out of this tunnel, bring her back through the sewers to the Rijksmuseum and show her to a doctor. He didn't want to call loudly his men, as it might add to the girl's anxiety, so he decided to lead her out of the passage himself. As he approached her, Hankey spoke softly to her, explaining that he would take her upstairs to safety. She seemed frightened of him, and Hankey became uneasy. She didn't make a sound, but as Hankey approached, she raised her hand and pointed her finger at the light on his helmet. He suddenly realized that the light must be scaring her somehow, so he simply removed the lantern and took it in his hand. The torch now illuminated the girl's shirt even brighter. The changed angle of illumination drew Hankey's attention to something disturbing. There was a star of yellow cloth pinned to the shirt. It surprised him, as it was very familiar, but it took him a while to remember what it reminded him of. It was exactly like the yellow stars that were imposed on the Jewish population during the persecution, so that non-Jews and members of the Nazi regime could identify them. Hankey's mind struggled with the implications of such a discovery. After a moment's pause, he picked himself up again, ignoring the cloth star and telling himself that he had to get this poor girl out of here. As he drew nearer, Hankey was seized with a feeling of great sadness. The lantern flickered strangely in his hand as he looked down at the girl. Hankey wasn't sure she could walk, and he prepared to carry her out of the sewers if necessary, but the sense of duty, which made him brave and resolute even in the strangest of situations, was replaced by something Hankey had never felt before. He was suddenly terrified. For Hankey had overlooked something very important. The girl had not stopped pointing at him as he approached. Her hand was tense and her finger remained extended, and even the light that was now in his hand did not seem to frighten her at all. The realization came over him like the plague. The girl was not pointing at the light, but behind his back. Hankey remembered nothing else of what had happened in the tunnel. He thanked God, which he was not usually inclined to do, that Jones and the men who had been so acutely afraid of that compartment had put that fear aside and rushed into the passage as soon as they heard his screams. Back in the alcove where he met the men, Hankey regained his composure, but immediately begged them to take him back out of the tunnels, which they did. Back in the elevator room of the Rijksmuseum, the men sat down and had a frank conversation with Henke about what had been going on downstairs over the past few months. Jones said that the first group of researchers to encounter this sewer passage had quit their posts after just one night spent there. A week later, one of their colleagues who decided to stay committed suicide after complaining to everyone that he could hear whispers coming from this tunnel when he worked nearby. Shortly thereafter, Jones' previous supervisor saw someone standing at the mouth of Tunnel 72F and followed him inside. One of the cleanup crews found him crawling out of the sewer on all fours, crying hysterically like a baby. He's been treated intensely since then, but no one knows exactly what he saw in there. He didn't want to talk about it, but the people who found him claimed he was convulsively repeating one word over and over again: Nazi. Henke was nervous after his experience and ordered no one to enter Tunnel 72F. He continued to work in the sewers, day after day in the dark. Over the next few weeks, he lost weight and began to sleep poorly, often waking up in an anxious state, drenched in cold sweat and unable to remember what he had dreamed. The very thought that the brave Henke could become so insignificant because of something he couldn't even explain hurt his pride and sense of self-worth. At first, he tried to overcome this feeling of helplessness by expanding his knowledge of the tunnels. As they say, knowledge is power, and Henke believed that if he knew more about this place in the dark, he would be less afraid of it. He read up on the history of the museum, and while little of it proved useful, one local legend stuck out to him. It was rumored that during World War II, several Jewish families had taken refuge in the tunnels beneath the Rijksmuseum. When two enemy officers became aware of their whereabouts, they entered the tunnels with local volunteers, hoping to arrest them there and most likely send them to a concentration camp. Rumor had it that the families ambushed the officers and their Nazi supporters, killed them, and dumped the bodies somewhere in the sewers. That was the story Henke told me. It was sad to see him so shaken and vulnerable. A strong, commanding personality who never showed even a hint of fear of anything had turned into a weakened man living on his nerves. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. Some people are haunted by both what they've seen and what they can't understand. The ego can be a terrible burden for any person. If broken, the consequences can be devastating. Henke couldn't shake the urge to feel like a strong and rational person again. He had never been afraid of anything before, and no matter what was in that tunnel, no matter how much I tried to dissuade him, he was determined to go there again and set things straight. 3 days later, Henke's body was found at the mouth of Tunnel 72F, stuffed in an old duffel bag. The cause of death was a heart attack, but whoever had broken, twisted and stuffed his body into that bag was never caught. It must be said that the bag was of particular interest to the police. It was found that it was made in Germany, more precisely, for the German army, and had not been produced since 1941.